All right, welcome back. Now we're on to part two of depression and bipolar disorder. Okay, so it's important to note that throughout the 50, 70 years that people have been prescribing antidepressants is that those same drugs have not just been used to treat depression. They've been used effectively to treat a wide swath of disorders. We've already talked about bipolar disorder, so they're used clearly to treat at least the depressive component of bipolar disorder. But they're also used to treat things like PTSD. They're definitely used effectively to treat anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder. They're also used to treat, in some cases, there's only a few of these antidepressants that are effective, but some are used to treat ADHD, some are used to treat social anxiety, and just one or two are used once in a while to treat bulimia too. So you have all these other uses for these drugs I just described. And here is just a summary from I think I got this from the book of these different of the different conditions: ADHD, MDD is major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic, post-traumatic stress disorder. So you see the list here of all these, how these common like SSRIs, SNRIs are used to treat these different disorders. All right, so they're 45% effective, all of these drugs, which is good. Again, you're helping 45% of the people out there who are suffering from depression. But their effectiveness led to the very logical hypothesis that depression is a direct consequence of low serotonin levels or low norepinephrine levels in your brain. And this has been called the monoaminergic theory of depression. And I've already talked about now the glucocorticoid and neurotrophic theories, and now we have a third one here, this monoaminergic theory. And that was the first theory, actually. I didn't put it first in this list because people aren't believing it as much anymore. But it was a clear theory, very logical hypothesis from the data. And basically it's yes, that depression is caused by low monoamine levels in the brain. If you increase it, you will reduce depression. So yes, it seems really logical, but there's a big elephant in the room here that people really haven't been able to get at for a while until more recently, and although we've known about it for a while, is that it takes a long time for antidepressants to work. It can take 2-3 weeks, maybe even longer, for antidepressants to take effect, even though their effect on increasing your norepinephrine and serotonin levels is effectively immediate, as in within hours. And so how could it be that if low serotonin levels are causing depression and you raise them, that you don't see an effect of that for weeks? So it suggests something else is going on, that it's not just low serotonin. It must be something related to neuroplasticity, something that these drugs are causing that takes longer to change, to affect the changes in the brain. So there has to be more to this story. And so one of the leading ideas that addresses that issue is this other hypothesis out there called the compensation hypothesis. All right. So again, remember we've already talked about the glucocorticoid hypothesis, the neurotrophic hypothesis, and I just mentioned the monoaminergic hypothesis. Now we have this, I think this is my final hypothesis, which is the compensation hypothesis for depression. And what is the compensation hypothesis? It's something that we've already talked about a bit in this class, and how if you're chronically reducing levels of a given chemical in the brain, then the receptors might step up and you might get more of them so that they can sense them. Similarly, if you have chronically high levels of a transmitter in the brain, then the receptors might leave, and so you might get fewer of them so they're not chronically activated all the time. That the brain has all these, quote, homeostatic mechanisms to keep things in balance. And so if there's some chronic elevation or reduction in transmitter level, you will change the distribution of receptors for that transmitter in the brain. And that's what we mean by compensation, that your brain is compensating for elevated or reduced levels of a transmitter. And so we do believe that there's a correlation with low serotonin levels and depression. And so that is something that people, today we still think is one of the clues to depression. But it's not the main thing, that if you just quickly elevate serotonin, you're not going to improve depressive symptoms. So it's not the whole story. But chronically low serotonin levels can result in essentially increases in the number of serotonin receptors in the brain. And generally those serotonin receptors are impacted by serotonin, but there are other transmitters that can sometimes affect those receptors, and having them at elevated levels can also cause changes that might contribute to depression. Especially there's some of those receptors like the 5-HT1A that I mentioned, which has been linked to depression. All right. So the idea then is that in depression, you have chronically low levels of serotonin, so that's going to cause an upregulation, an increase in the number of those serotonin receptors levels. But then if you're given an SSRI, what you're going to do is you're going to chronically elevate those serotonin levels for days or weeks. And as a result, all of those extra, perhaps pathological receptors are going to be pulled away from the synapse to bring things back into balance. And so they're going to be reduced, either removed from the synapse, or their sensitivity to serotonin is going to be reduced. Another way is that you could have more autoreceptors to serotonin, for example, to be added to the presynaptic terminal so that less serotonin is released. And so you have all these adaptive changes that can happen that ultimately result in, for example, removal of serotonin receptors that might have been there because of the chronic reduction in serotonin and depression. And so when you're given the SSRIs, you're increasing the levels, which essentially causes those pathological receptors to be pulled away. All right. And so that's the neuroplastic idea, is that you're causing this weeks-long change in the distribution of those receptors. There is some evidence for that, in that depressed patients who don't get treatment, who don't get SSRIs, for example, have increased postsynaptic serotonin receptor levels, and that those who do get medication, who are treated with SSRIs, have reduced serotonin receptor levels. And the time course by which those receptors are added, or reduced in this case, is similar to the time course at which the SSRIs work. And so it takes around 2 to 3 weeks or so for antidepressants to really work, but that's exactly the time that it takes for a reduction in the serotonin receptor levels when you're taking SSRIs. Okay, switching gears. So before we just finished covering some of the core thoughts on how we think antidepressant medications work, and generally some general theories on how we think depression occurs, period. Is it because of elevated or reduced, in this case, serotonin levels, due to reduced levels of BDNF, due to increased levels of cortisol? All these other things have come into play. But now let's talk about something else. Let's talk about how we can actually increase potentially the effectiveness of existing medications used to treat depression through drugs and vitamins. And so the book actually has this nice little section that goes over this. I'm not going to go into it into nearly as much detail as the book does, but I'm just going to give you a little list here because it's interesting, and people don't usually talk about this stuff. So I was happy the book brought these ideas up. So these are 4 different drugs or elements and minerals, vitamins, minerals that can actually improve, in some cases, the effectiveness of the traditional antidepressants. One is lithium, which can improve the antidepressant efficacy, which is just an element, a very common element in the earth, very reactive. The omega-3 fatty acids, which are found in like fish oil, for example, can also do the same thing, improve antidepressants. Folate, another one, which is a common B vitamin that you can get. You can get supplements if you're low on folate that can improve the effectiveness. And St. John's wort is an herb, or at least an extract from an herb, and that's been used to treat depression. I think it started in Germany, but it seems to also be effective and might even mimic the effects of BDNF in the hippocampus. There's actually one paper on that. So again, these are some ways you might be able to augment or even improve the effectiveness of existing antidepressants. All right, now moving on to even more kind of novel new things, new treatments for depression. And in this, I'll talk about ketamine. And then I'll move on to non-drug treatment, some of which has been around for a long, long time, but how that non-drug treatments are also used to treat depression, and often in conjunction with traditional medications. All right, ketamine. We've already talked a lot about ketamine in regard to how it's a psychedelic if taken in high enough doses. And if taken in very high doses, it's an anesthetic. And ketamine, if you remember, acts on the NMDA receptor to effectively block it. But the end result, even though it's blocking that receptor, is that overall levels of glutamate in the brain may actually be increasing, and you might get an overactivation or high activation of the AMPA glutamate receptor. So you have these two excitatory glutamate receptors, the NMDA and the AMPA, and the NMDA is getting blocked, but the AMPA might be getting more activated. As we already learned, yes, it's a dissociative hallucinogen, and there's been a lot of evidence now in the last 10 years that it is it's an effective antidepressant. And what's crazy about it is that you can get effectively instant relief. So remember, the SSRIs and the SNRIs and the traditional tricyclics and MAOIs, they can take 2-3 weeks before you see a relief of symptoms. But you can see relief of symptoms from ketamine in 1 hour after administration. So, and it can last for weeks. And so it can be pretty awe-inspiring in actually how quickly it can help some of these patients. It's been typically only used for treatment-resistant patients, so usually the worst of the worst because it's a little more experimental. However, it's finding more and more common use, and currently the estimates is that it works around about 65 to 70% of the treatment-resistant patients. We don't know how well it works in your average non-treatment-resistant patient because we don't have as much data there. But if you remember, regular antidepressants were about 45% effective in your average patient. At least for treatment-resistant patients, ketamine is pretty darn effective, even higher than that. So that's pretty good. So ketamine, this is data from my own research and from Tony Yee and others in my lab, where we found that ketamine can really massively change the activity of neurons in the brain. I mean massive. I've never seen, I've done neuroscience since officially 1997. And in all the time I've done neural recordings from brains, in my case, mostly rat brains or mouse brains, I have never seen a drug or an event, brainwave, that has been as powerful as ketamine in changing how neurons synchronize their activity with one another. It essentially is really amazing to see. You give a ketamine injection to a rat and their brains just go, almost look like they're on fire. You get these really high synchronous patterns of activity. And I'll talk about why I think that's important in a second. All right. And the figure here on the right, by the way, is from my lab. This is actually from work that Tony Yee did, who is now at UCLA. So this is some really neat stuff where he injected ketamine. On the left, you have these different areas of the brain, motor cortex, and DLS, NAC are in the striatum. NAC is nucleus accumbens. You guys remember that. CA3 is in the hippocampus, and S1 is somatosensory cortex. And so this is, the white line indicates when you injected, in this case, saline, so just salt water, effectively. And then the y-axis on each of these plots indicates the frequency of a brain wave. So if a brain wave is really fast, it would be, let's say, at 150 times a second. If a brain wave is really slow, it would be near the bottom, maybe 10 times a second. And here is, again, with saline on the A plot. And then the C plot over here, I guess I skipped B, but the C plot over here, you have the injection of ketamine. And you just see this massive increase in high frequency oscillation activity in the brain, in this case, motor cortex, in the striatum. And then you see this kind of a different flavor of a brain wave, brain activity in the hippocampus and in somatosensory cortex. So it changes a bit depending on where you put your electrodes. All right. Over here is another plot. So here's just some brain waves in the upper right there, recorded from motor cortex M1 and ventral striatum, which is the nucleus accumbens. And so you can just see the differences in brain waves triggered by ketamine here just by looking at squiggles. So I spent a lot of my life looking at squiggles of brain waves, and those are some good squiggles over there. All right. So one theory that we have with ketamine, and again, we're studying ketamine mostly in the context of Parkinson's disease, but I think it might, some of the stuff we're working on might apply to depression as well. And one general theory we have is that ketamine introduces a brand new brain wave in the brain, this kind of high frequency activity throughout the brain. And then you have brain-derived neurotrophic factor that is increased. And there's already plenty of evidence suggesting that within 24 hours after taking ketamine, your brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels go up. And so we think that ketamine's instantiating in the brain a brand new brain state. And then that brain state is somewhat getting locked in by this increase in neuroplasticity that's caused by BDNF. And that essentially short circuits or reroutes those circuits in the brain that were causing the depression, that might have had those loops of negative thinking going on, those negative memories of yourself, perhaps, that were being rehearsed again and again that were contributing to stress and depression. The idea is that this might reverse that, and then the increase in BDNF itself might just itself be beneficial to treating depression. And so that's the idea, is that the general theory that we're working on right now, although we're not testing it, again, in the context of depression. One thing that is interesting, though, is that ketamine's effects are immediate, like within an hour, but it takes longer, like I said, up to 24 hours for BDNF to change. And so this doesn't all quite make sense with this nice theory that we have going on. All right, that is the end of part 2.